Above the city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 20 million tons of water sat behind a wall of dirt and clay. When that wall failed on May 31, 1889, the resulting wave killed more than 2,200 people. It remains one of the deadliest civil engineering disasters in American history. The official engineering report, published 2 years later by the American Society of Civil Engineers, concluded the catastrophe was essentially inevitable, an act of God too powerful for any structure to withstand. That conclusion was false. Modern hydraulic modeling, conducted a century after the flood, proved that the original dam would have survived the 1889 storm. It failed because wealthy men had quietly dismantled every safety system it possessed. The truth about Johnstown was buried twice, first under 20 feet of debris, then under a fraudulent report signed by the most respected engineers in America. Today, we dig it out. The South Fork Dam was completed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1853. Its purpose was practical: to supply a steady head of water to the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal during dry summer months. The reservoir it created stretched nearly 3 miles across the valley of the South Fork of the Little Conemaugh River in Cambria County, western Pennsylvania. The structure itself was an earthen embankment dam, 72 feet tall and approximately 900 feet long, built from compacted layers of earth and clay. Earthen dams function through mass and geometry. Their enormous weight and broad base distribute hydrostatic pressure across a wide footprint, making them highly resistant to the horizontal force of water. They were, and still are, legitimate large-scale engineering solutions. But they have one absolute physical vulnerability: they cannot be overtopped. The moment water flows over the crest of an earthen dam, it begins eroding the downstream face. That erosion cannot be stopped once it begins. Total structural collapse follows. The original engineers understood this completely. They built 3 independent safety systems into the South Fork Dam to ensure overtopping would never occur, regardless of weather conditions. The first was a wide spillway, a channel 72 feet across, cut directly into the solid rock at the dam's western end. This provided a large capacity bypass for extreme flood events, allowing excess water to drain safely around the earthen structure. The second was a deliberate asymmetry in the crest elevation. The center of the dam was built 2 feet higher than the ends. If an extreme event ever overwhelmed the spillway, water would reach the ends of the dam first, where the earthen structure was anchored to bedrock, not the vulnerable center, where failure would be catastrophic. The third system was a set of 5 cast iron discharge pipes, each 2 feet in diameter, housed in a stone culvert at the base of the dam. Operated by heavy valves in a control tower above, these pipes allowed engineers to preemptively drain the reservoir before a major storm, or reduce water pressure rapidly during an emergency. With all 3 systems functional, the dam represented sound engineering for its era. The city of Johnstown, 14 miles downstream, was protected. That protection lasted only as long as the safety systems did. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was formed in 1879 by a group of Pittsburgh industrialists seeking a private retreat in the mountains. Its membership eventually reached 61 individuals and included Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, Henry Clay Frick, and Pennsylvania Railroad Superintendent Robert Pitcairn. In 1881, the club purchased the abandoned reservoir property for a nominal sum. What they wanted was the lake. What they inherited, without adequate consideration, was the dam holding it in place. Making the property usable required a road across the crest. To create a stable crossing, the dam's crest was lowered by an estimated 2 to 3 feet. This single decision eliminated both of the crest-level safety features the original engineers had built in: the 2-foot buffer at the center and the height advantage that would have directed any overflow toward the rock-anchored ends rather than the earthen middle. The road now sat at a level where an extreme flood would reach the crest, with virtually no margin remaining. The second modification was more consequential. The 5 cast-iron discharge pipes at the base of the dam were removed. No formal engineering authorization for their removal has ever been identified in the historical record. Some accounts indicate they were extracted during leak repairs and never replaced. Others suggest they were sold as scrap. The result was unambiguous. The reservoir could no longer be drained in advance of a storm. There was no emergency drawdown mechanism. Whatever water entered the lake during a major rain event had only one way out: over the top. To support the road, the spillway was also partially obstructed. More critically, the club installed iron fish screens across the spillway's discharge channel to prevent stocked trout and bass from escaping the lake. These screens appear in multiple eyewitness accounts from the years before 1889. Their hydraulic implication was direct. Any flood event driving debris-laden water through the spillway would clog those screens, progressively reducing drainage capacity toward zero precisely when maximum capacity was needed. The danger was not theoretical. In 1880, Daniel Morrell, president of Cambria Iron in Johnstown and one of the most experienced industrial engineers in Pennsylvania, sent a written inspection report to the club expressing serious concern about the dam's structural condition and the adequacy of its spillway. He proposed a joint engineering review. The club declined. Morrell remained concerned until his death in 1885. His letters to the club are preserved in the historical record. The modifications stood, and the dam held through 9 years of ordinary weather. Each year without incident was silently misread as confirmation that the margins were unnecessary. The storm system that struck western Pennsylvania on May 30th and 31, 1889, was a large extratropical cyclone that had tracked east across the Midwest before stalling against the Allegheny Mountains. Over the 47 square miles of watershed draining into the South Fork Reservoir, estimated rainfall totals for the 24-hour period reached 6 to 8 inches, roughly 2 months of average May precipitation in a single day. The ground was already saturated from earlier spring rains. Every stream feeding the lake ran at extraordinary volume. The reservoir entered May 31st near full capacity. By early morning, the lake was rising measurably each hour. John Park, a 23-year-old assistant engineer stationed at the club, arrived at the dam and recognized immediately that this was unlike any previous spring flood. The fish screens across the spillway were already clogged with branches and debris. Laborers worked continuously to clear them. More debris arrived faster than they could remove it. The effective drainage capacity of the already narrowed spillway was collapsing in real time. Park rode to the town of South Fork and telegraphed warnings down the Pennsylvania Railroad line toward Johnstown. Multiple messages were transmitted throughout the morning. Most reached the city. They were received calmly. The town had heard warnings about the South Fork Dam before. Previous alarms had produced no flood, and the population had been effectively conditioned not to evacuate. When people in Johnstown looked out at the rain that morning, many assumed it was simply another false alarm. At the dam, workers attempted to cut an emergency auxiliary spillway through the hillside on the eastern side of the structure. With hand tools and limited time, it was not physically possible. The trench they managed to dig was negligible in depth and contributed nothing to the drainage of the lake. Sometime around 11:30 that morning, water reached the crest of the dam and began flowing over it. The moment overtopping began, the outcome was fixed by physics. Water running over the downstream face of an earthen dam erodes the material rapidly, far faster than overtopping erodes the upstream face or the crest. Within minutes, a visible notch had formed at the lowest point of the crest, near the center, the exact location the original engineers had made highest for precisely this reason, and where the club's road construction had reduced the elevation. The notch widened. The breach widened. By approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, the entire center section of the South Fork Dam had ceased to exist. 20 million tons of water entered the valley of the Little Conemaugh River. 20 million tons of water does not behave like a river when it is released all at once through a narrow gap. It behaves like a hydraulic ram. The valley of the Little Conemaugh River between South Fork Dam and Johnstown is approximately 14 miles long. For much of that distance, the valley floor is narrow, in places no more than a few hundred feet wide, flanked by steep hillsides that prevented the released water from spreading laterally. Instead, the entire volume was funneled downhill in a single-channeled mass. The elevation difference between the dam site and Johnstown is approximately 450 feet. The water had that entire drop to accelerate across 14 miles of confinement. The wave that emerged from the breach was not simply water. Within seconds of leaving the dam, it was scouring the valley floor and walls, picking up everything in its path. Trees hundreds of years old were uprooted instantly. Sections of the Pennsylvania Railroad bed, including iron rails and heavy wooden ties, were swept into the moving mass. Houses in the small communities immediately downstream, Mineral Point, South Fork Town itself, were lifted from their foundations and carried forward. The wave was converting itself into a slurry of debris, traveling at an estimated 20 to 40 feet in height, depending on location, and moving at speeds that varied between 15 and 22 miles per hour as the valley narrowed and constricted. The communities in the valley between the dam and Johnstown were struck with almost no warning. Mineral Point was destroyed in minutes. East Conemaugh, where the Pennsylvania Railroad maintained a large rail yard, was hit while workers were still attempting to move locomotives to higher ground. Several engines were swept off the tracks. At least 2 were carried significant distances by the wave. The most consequential collision before Johnstown occurred at Woodvale, a borough immediately upstream of the city. Woodvale was home to the Gautier Wire Works, a large industrial facility operated by the Cambria Iron Company. The wave demolished the plant entirely, and in doing so incorporated thousands of coils of barbed wire into the debris mass. This wire would not be seen clearly until after the disaster, tangled through the wreckage and wrapped around victims. It was one of the factors that made rescue operations in the hours and days following the flood especially difficult, and contributed directly to the death toll. By the time the wave reached the edge of Johnstown proper, it was no longer identifiable as water. It was a moving wall of compacted destruction: mud, timber, rail iron, industrial equipment, pieces of houses, and wire. Somewhere between 30 and 40 feet high at its leading edge, carrying the kinetic energy of an entire lake. Johnstown in 1889 was a city of approximately 30,000 people. It sat at the confluence of the Little Conemaugh River and Stony Creek, in a natural bowl surrounded by hills. That topography, the same hills that made the valley scenic and the railroad route efficient, made Johnstown a trap. The surrounding slopes were higher ground. The city floor was not. The wave reached Johnstown at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The journey from the broken dam had taken roughly 45 minutes. By the time the debris mass entered the city, it had been traveling for 14 miles, collecting material continuously and losing little of its kinetic energy. At the point of impact, the wave was moving between 15 and 18 miles per hour, fast enough to sweep a street clear of every structure on it before any occupant could respond. The destruction of central Johnstown took less than 10 minutes. Wooden structures, and the majority of the city's residential buildings were wooden, were demolished on contact. The wave did not push houses, it disaggregated them. Walls separated from foundations, roofs separated from walls, floors separated from frames. The components joined the debris mass and became weapons against whatever stood downstream. Brick structures fared better. Several remained standing after the wave passed, their upper floors crowded with survivors who had moments earlier watched the water rise to their windows and then recede. The people who survived in the city center generally did so by reaching upper floors of masonry buildings, by climbing to rooftops, or by being carried on floating debris to the margins of the flood zone where they could reach higher ground. Those in wooden structures on the valley floor had virtually no time to respond. The water rose to the second floor of most surviving buildings within minutes of impact. Many accounts from survivors describe seeing neighbors swept from windows or off rooftops while attempting to move to safer positions. The Conemaugh Valley's narrow geometry continued to concentrate the water long after the initial wave passed. Stony Creek, flowing normally from the south, met the debris-filled floodwater from the north. The confluence backed water up, raising levels throughout the city center. For hours after the main impact, Johnstown was submerged under 10 to 20 feet of water and compacted wreckage. The confirmed death toll reached 2,209. 99 entire families were killed without a single surviving member. 777 of the identified dead were never matched to a name. The youngest victims were infants. The oldest were in their 80s. The common factor was not age, or location, or circumstance. It was proximity to the valley floor when the lake arrived. At the lower end of Johnstown, where the Little Conemaugh River bends south to join Stony Creek, the Pennsylvania Railroad had built a stone arch bridge. It was a massive, solid structure, multiple arched spans of cut stone, built to carry the weight of heavy freight locomotives. When the debris wave reached it, the bridge did not move. What happened next was not anticipated by anyone in the valley. The bridge became a dam. The debris mass, houses, timber, rail iron, industrial machinery, barbed wire, uprooted trees, and the compacted remnants of everything the wave had carried for 14 miles, piled up against the upstream face of the bridge spans. The arches were too small to pass the volume of material arriving at them. Within a short time, an enormous debris field had accumulated across the full width of the river, backed up for hundreds of feet upstream, in places reaching 30 to 40 feet in depth. The bridge held all of it in place. This secondary impoundment raised water levels throughout the already flooded city. Survivors who had reached the upper floors of masonry buildings or who were clinging to floating wreckage found that the water was not receding as it might have. The debris field had created a new obstruction, and the valley was filling again behind it. People were alive inside the pile. Survivors trapped beneath collapsed floors, pinned by beams, or sheltered in pockets of air within the wreckage, called out through the evening of May 31st. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, conducted by other survivors on the margins of the debris field who worked without equipment, in fading daylight, across an unstable surface of compressed and tangled wreckage. Then, the pile caught fire. The ignition source has never been conclusively established, but the materials were already inside. Tank cars from the Pennsylvania Railroad Yard at East Conemaugh, carrying petroleum products, documented in eyewitness accounts from the wave's path through the yard, had been swept into the debris mass while workers were still attempting to move locomotives to higher ground. Overturned stoves from demolished houses provided additional ignition points across the pile, and the barbed wire swept in from the Gautier Wire Works at Woodvale, incorporated into the wave before it reached Johnstown, ran in coils through the compressed wreckage, making the surface of the pile effectively impassable for anyone trying to move across it. The fire burned for 3 days. It consumed the entire accumulated debris field at the stone bridge, along with an unknown number of people who had survived the initial flood. Estimates of the fire's death toll range from 80 to over 200, though the destruction of the debris mass and the bodies within it made precise accounting impossible. Survivors on the margins of the debris field reported hearing voices from inside the pile through the first night. The wire that the wave had carried 14 miles from an industrial facility in Woodvale was the reason those voices could not be reached. That is the disaster the water caused. The next part is the disaster the lawyers caused. Subscribe to Buried Earth. Every episode follows a buried record to its end. In the weeks after the disaster, the American Society of Civil Engineers appointed a committee to investigate the failure of the South Fork Dam. The committee was led by James B. Francis, one of the most technically distinguished hydraulic engineers in the country, the designer of the Francis turbine, a hydraulic mechanism so precisely engineered that it remains in continuous use in power generation worldwide today. The Francis turbine works by controlling the movement of water through a closed system with mechanical precision, extracting energy without loss of structural integrity. In 1891, the engineer who designed it signed a report concluding that nothing could have controlled the movement of water at Johnstown, that the removal of the discharge pipes, the lowering of the crest, and the obstruction of the spillway were irrelevant to the outcome. The investigation was taken seriously. The report, published in 1891, carried the full institutional authority of American engineering. Its central conclusion was that the storm of May 31st, 1889, was so severe and unprecedented that the dam would have failed regardless of its condition. The report held that even with the original discharge pipes in place, the lake could not have been drained rapidly enough to prevent overtopping. Even with the original crest elevation, the water would have reached and exceeded it. The failure, according to the 1891 ASCE committee, was essentially an act of God, a hydrometeorological event beyond the capacity of any human engineering to withstand. That conclusion had a direct legal consequence. No member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ever successfully prosecuted or held liable in civil court for the deaths of 2,209 people. Pennsylvania courts applied the Act of God doctrine. Lawsuits filed by survivors and victims' families were systematically dismissed. The club's members, Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, and the rest, contributed generously to the relief fund, which ultimately raised approximately $3,700,000. The contributions were prominent and well publicized. They were also legally irrelevant. Charity is not liability. What the 1891 report did not address with equal rigor was the documentary record of the modifications. The removal of the discharge pipes received minimal analysis. The lowering of the crest was acknowledged, but not modeled against the actual storm event. The fish screens and their role in destroying the spillway's capacity during the flood were noted, but not quantified. Daniel Morell's written warnings to the club, sent 9 years before the disaster and preserved in correspondence archives, were not prominently examined. The committee's membership has been scrutinized by subsequent researchers. Several members had professional and institutional ties to the industrial circles from which the club's membership was drawn. Whether those ties influence the conclusions cannot be proven definitively from the historical record. What the record does show is that the investigation produced a report whose central finding, that the original dam would also have failed, was not supported by independent hydraulic modeling. That modeling did not exist in 1891. It would take another century before anyone ran the numbers. The 1891 ASC report rested on a claim that could not be tested with 19th-century tools, that the original South Fork Dam, with its discharge pipes and full crest elevation intact, would have failed anyway. This was presented as an engineering judgment. It was not a calculation. The computational hydraulic modeling required to actually simulate dam performance under specific storm conditions did not exist in 1891. It exists now. Research conducted in the late 20th century by engineers and National Park Service historians, including Lew Walter, whose detailed analysis was compiled through the Johnstown Flood National Memorial's Historical Studies Program, and subsequent geotechnical analysts who applied computational hydraulic modeling to the specific storm event, examined the actual conditions of May 31, 1889. The question they asked was precise. If the 5 discharge pipes had been operational the night before the storm peaked, how much could the reservoir level have been reduced? If the crest had remained at its original elevation, how much additional freeboard would that have provided? If the spillway had retained its original 72-foot width without the fish screens, how much additional drainage capacity would have existed during the critical hours? The findings contradicted the 1891 report directly. With the original discharge pipes functioning, operators could have drained a meaningful volume of water from the reservoir in the 12 to 18 hours before the dam was threatened. With the original crest elevation, 2 to 3 feet higher at the center, the water would not have reached overtopping level during the 1889 storm. The hydraulic analysis indicated that the South Fork Dam, as originally designed and built, had sufficient capacity to survive the May 31st event. The storm was severe. It was not, by the standards of the original engineering, unsurvivable. The 1891 report's central conclusion, that the disaster was essentially inevitable, regardless of what the club had done, was wrong. The modifications made by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club between 1881 and 1889 were not incidental to the disaster. They were the mechanism of the disaster. The storm provided the water. The missing pipes and the lowered crest provided the failure. No member of the club was ever held legally accountable. The Act of God doctrine protected them completely. Carnegie Hall opened in 1891, the same year the ASC report was published, and the same year the legal interpretation of what happened at Johnstown was fixed in the record. The Frick Collection opened in 1935. Between those two dates, the survivors aged, the lawsuits expired without recovery, and the official narrative calcified. The 2,209 people buried in Johnstown cemeteries do not appear in the name of any institution funded by the men the 1891 report absolved. The Johnstown flood was not a mystery. The evidence was in the ground, in the archives, and in the engineering record from the moment the dam failed. The hydraulic modeling answered the engineering question a century later. What it could not change was what the courts had already decided, and what they decided remains standing. The act of God doctrine, applied to a structure whose safety systems had been privately dismantled, shielded the modifiers from the consequence of the modification. The modern findings prove the 1891 conclusion was wrong. They provided no mechanism to act on that proof. The valley knew. The numbers confirmed it. The law did not move.